brief to the Supreme Court. As you probably know, they're going to be deciding probably in June a case that came up to them from the District of Columbia contesting the gun ban in the District of Columbia. And a lower federal court had ruled that that was an infringement of an individual right to keep and bear arms. And so the majority of that federal court overturned the D.C. gun ban. Now, the issue before the Supreme Court is precisely that, a purely constitutional issue, and it doesn't even involve any other consideration such as, well, does the Second Amendment apply to the states? D.C. is not a state, it's basically a department of the federal government, and so it's a pure Second Amendment issue. What does the Second Amendment mean? And we share your concern about the notion that a lot of judges have that they can infringe because they've, especially if they're on the Supreme Court, they've kind of taken to the idea that they're the supreme constitutional convention, and that every time they're sitting, they can amend the Constitution. So, knowing that, fearing that, we, in our brief, went back to an early 19th century dictionary that was pretty much contemporaneous with the times of the writing and the acceptance of the Second Amendment and the Bill of Rights. That was in 1791, and we found a dictionary that was put together just a few years later. And we told the court, okay, guys, here's what infringe means. Just as you were saying, maybe in 21st century parlance, we can say, keep your hands off. And we also pointed out to them that the consequences of that could be pretty severe, that our forefathers had endured a long string of abuses. They didn't just rush off to start shooting at British soldiers. They petitioned, and those petitions fell on deaf ears, and as we pointed out in our brief, came a time when our forefathers had to resist tyranny by force of arms. So, too, we went on to point out in our brief, this generation is watching what the court is doing. And I think that's a very key part of the whole argument. I mean, we could go in and talk about what it means to say you have a militia, what it means to have a well-regulated militia. But when you cut to the chase, it means don't infringe. And the state of Montana, interestingly, has this idea. The Democrat-controlled legislature passed a resolution, and I believe it was voted on almost unanimously, that said if you decide that you can infringe the Second Amendment, that will put into question the compact by which Montana entered the Union in 1889. Now, that's pretty clear.
That's interesting. With the Supreme Court, they're saying that you have a right, and now they're going to rule and say what that right is, and this judgment that they hand down could have broad ramifications across the whole United States, couldn't it?
Yes, sir. In fact, I see them doing two things. First of all, I think they are going to overturn many of the lower courts that have ruled that the Second Amendment is only a collective right that only gives you and me the right to have a gun if we belong to the militia of our state, of New York, of whatever it might be. But then they're going to go on, I'm afraid, and say that it should be left to the reasonable interpretation of a federal judge to decide whether a particular gun law, a ban, a restriction of some kind is constitutional or not. And that's why we put such clear, might say strong language in our brief, and why the state of Montana in their legislature went on record the way they did. So I can see some kind of, okay, you've got an individual right to keep and bear arms, but we're going to decide exactly what that means on a case-by-case basis. That's what judges like to do.
Mr. Pratt, this is Brian. Good morning to you, sir. Thank you for being on the Real News Radio this morning with us.
A pleasure.
And I truly appreciate what you're doing to defend our Second Amendment, sir.
Well, they keep our hands full. Gun Owners of America is primarily lobbying here in Washington, but and we've certainly been active in the courts, well, as you can tell from the discussion of our brief. And we've got some other matters before some of the other federal courts. So defense of the Second Amendment is it's a big deal. There's a lot of attacks both in the Congress and in the courts. And a lot of the political leaders, I think, would rather we didn't have a Second Amendment. They don't really appreciate exactly what it means to have an armed people. But the fact that you've got an armed people, it's really another way of saying that the people are sovereign. It's the embodiment of the people's power when they're armed. And if they're disarmed, they're just subjects. And they really don't have much choice but to do whatever the government tells them to do.
Now, Mr. Pratt, you have visited countries like South Africa when you were invited by the gun owners of South Africa as a guest speaker. What is your assessment of countries such as South Africa, England, Australia, which have imposed serious firearms control legislation and full-fledged bans of firearms? Is this a prelude to complete state control?
Oh, there's no question about it. It's in England, the government is not as threatening and dictatorial yet, anyway, as it is in South Africa. But crime has just gone up through the roof. So what they argued was going to be to make England a more peaceful place. Turns out that on this island nation, after they confiscated everybody's legally owned guns, that was 10 years to 11 years ago, and that was about 1.6 million guns. That's all that was left in the country. Now the police figure there are some 3 million guns illegally in the country, and you know, it sounds kind of trite, but Americans are wont to say that when guns are made illegal, only outlaws will have guns. And I think, golly, that's exactly what's happened in England, and the criminals are much bolder than ever, and violent crime is just out of control. Now, they have the same crime threat, and they're suffering from the same rage of criminal activity in South Africa. There, the law is more, it doesn't appear to be quite what it really is. It says, well, you have to have a license and you have to have it renewed every so many years. What they're doing is when your anniversary comes up and you go in to renew your license, they just find ways that they're not going to renew it. And so early on in the process, South African gun owners realized that the government intended to disarm them. In fact, the communist, and he is a communist, he's part of the African National Congress, and when they appointed him head of the Interior Ministry, which oversees gun control, they put out his resume, and he's a proud member of the Communist Party of South Africa, and he announced that the law was going to be used to disarm South Africans. Now, that's not what they said when they were enacting the law. Then they were trying to keep people more at ease. Well, indeed, they have been using it to disarm people, and once that became apparent, something very interesting happened. Some blacks decided that they just weren't going to go along with it because they got to live in very dangerous, very high crime neighborhoods, black townships all over South Africa on the outskirts of downtown